What's up guys, my name is Ace, and today I wanted to finally dive into the rear grip category of attachments in Black Ops 6 and primarily focus on the ergonomic and the CQB grips. And the reason I want to focus on these two in particular is they're the ones with the very interesting effects. They improve both our sprint to fire and our dive to fire times, which is much more interesting than the other ones that just improve our aim down sight or sprint to fire times, which are obviously just really straightforward. But I've had a lot of people wondering how these interact with each other. Are they crutches? Are they like absolutely necessary if you're an aggressive player? Or can you do without them just fine? So diving right in, with both of these rear grips, both the ergonomic and the CQB, we can see in the advanced stats they improve our slide to fire time by 50%, and that's a massive improvement, obviously. However, when it comes to dive to fire time, for some reason they don't state this in the advanced stats, and therefore I have had to resort to hand testing dive to fire times. And with my hand testing, it appears the ergonomic and CQB grips will improve your dive to fire time by about 40 to 60%. There is some variance there, but this is hand testing, and especially with really small values like this, hand testing can only take you so far. So I'm inclined to believe that this is actually coded at 50%, but if it's not exactly that value, it's at least somewhere around there, which is, again, a very massive improvement to our dive to fire time. And therefore, if you're implementing a lot of slides and dives, it seems that these are just no-brainer attachments. However, it still raises some questions about various interactions, because one key thing you may or may not know from Call of Duty is the interaction between our sprint to fire and our aim down sight time. So let's do a quick recap of that just to set the stage for why I'm testing the other interactions. If your sprint to fire time is slower than your aim down sight time, which it will often be, especially if you're tactical sprinting, because then you have your tactical sprint out time. In these cases, if you break your sprint by aiming down sight and you want to aim down sight and fire as soon as possible, your aim down sight speed is actually going to be slowed to match your sprint to fire time in that situation. So even if I have attachments on my gun to give me a 150 millisecond aim down sight speed, if I'm coming out of a tac sprint with a sprint out time of 300 milliseconds, let's say, I won't actually be getting fully aim down sight until 300 milliseconds has elapsed. It will slow that time down. Whereas if I'm just standing still and want to aim down sight, then I will be getting that proper 150 millisecond aim down sight speed. And this is just to avoid situations where you can get fully aimed down sight, but then your gun won't fire. That really feels awkward in FPS games if you can end up in situations like that. So I definitely see why they do it, and it is really important to know that this interaction exists, primarily because you typically want to try to find a balance between your sprint out and aim down sight time. If you go all in on aim down sight time, but you have a terrible sprint out time, then if you are playing aggressively and you're often coming out of sprint into gunfights, unfortunately in these situations you won't be able to take advantage of that really fast aim down sight speed that you've got. And this was the first thing I wanted to test here when we're looking at slide to fire versus dive to fire time versus aim down sight time. Will this have the same effect on our aim down sight speed? So if I initiate slide, for instance, and my slide to fire time is like 400 milliseconds, but my aim down sight time is 150 milliseconds again, is it going to slow my aim down sight time so I can't get fully aim down sight till my gun is ready to fire? Or not? And the same thing goes with the dive to fire time. Well, it turns out, no, we don't see this same interaction. You can get fully aimed down sight even though your gun isn't ready to fire if you're sliding or diving. And therefore, aim down sight speed is totally independent from your slide to fire or dive to fire speed. And that can be quite nice because as you're sliding or diving, you can get fully aimed down sight and really get your sights aligned on somebody even though your gun isn't ready to go. And then once it is ready to fire, you're fully accurate, you're on point, and you can get those shots off. It's also important to know that if you are sliding or diving a lot, you aren't wasting an attachment if you're trying to improve your aim down sight speed when your aim down sight speed is so significantly faster than those values. So I know a lot of this might seem really technical and unnecessary to break this down in this much detail, but I do know a lot of people were curious about that. And another big interaction people are curious about, myself included before doing this testing, is how sprint to fire time also interacts with slide to fire or dive to fire. Like when I initiate a slide, for instance, do I have to wait for my slide to fire time, then my sprint to fire time before my gun actually goes off? Or do these happen simultaneously? And if they do happen simultaneously, what happens if I have a really slow sprint to fire time, much slower than my slide to fire time, and then I slide and want to fire my gun? Do I have to wait extra time for my sprint to fire time to finish before my gun can go off? Well, it turns out in this case, slide to fire and dive to fire times override your sprint to fire time. And what this means is you can actually get into situations where you have an extremely slow sprint to fire time, like with an LMG, for instance, in tac sprint. If I'm using the ergonomic grip, I could get a slide to fire time of 205 milliseconds, but my tactical sprint to fire time on the XMG, for instance, would be 330 milliseconds. So before I did this testing, I was thinking in this situation, when I activate a slide and I want to fire as soon as possible, I thought it would take 330 milliseconds before my gun was ready to go, because that's my tactical sprint to fire time. But it turns out this value is overridden by the slide to fire time when you are sliding, meaning I can actually start firing 205 milliseconds after I initiate the slide. Well, that plus you have to add the open bolt delay of 50 milliseconds, but that's a separate story with LMGs. And it turns out the exact same thing applied with our dive to fire time. Your dive to fire time will override your sprint to fire time if it's a lower value than your sprint to fire. And this is really important to know, and it may actually affect some of your attachment selection or even your play style, because you can actually get around having a slow sprint to fire time as long as you're ensuring you're always sliding or diving into your fights out of a sprint rather than just sprinting out and shooting. And this actually makes the ergonomic grip extremely valuable if you adopt that playstyle. Whereas with the CQB grip, this is much better if you also plan on just sprinting out and shooting your gun without initiating a slide or a dive to do that. And that's really the key difference between these two attachments. Since they have the exact same impact on our slide to fire and dive to fire times, it then becomes all about, do I want to improve my aim down sight speed on top of that or my sprint to fire time on top of that? And at the end of all of this, one other tip I wanted to provide here is a really deadly combination I find for really highly aggressive play with lots of omni movement. And this is combining that CQB grip, so we get better slide to fire, dive to fire, and sprint to fire time, with the Strelic laser, which doesn't technically improve our aim down sight speed, but for anybody that's seen the video about the Strelic laser that I made, which I will leave linked down below, this gives you effectively like a 0 aim down sight time with your gun. So this means you're always going to be able to fire as quickly as possible, while also being able to get at least almost fully accurate nearly instantly. And this is the combination I tend to go with my most aggressive setups. And at the end of the day, when it comes to my thoughts on ergonomic versus CQB and whether or not either of them are really worth it, I would say if you're not really implementing slides or dives into your gameplay, then don't worry about these attachments. You're probably just better off with one of the other rear grips. It's potentially going to give you a better benefit to either aim down sight time or sprint out time. In saying that though, I absolutely recommend mixing at least some slides into your gameplay. And if you are sliding or diving a fair amount, these two rear grips are incredibly important on your setup, and they will make quite a big difference in any situation where you are implementing slides or dives. In fact, I found as I was leveling up many of my guns, the moment I finally got to unlocking one of these two attachments, it totally changed my gameplay and allowed me to feel a lot more confident sliding or diving into my gunfights, which I really like doing, but without these attachments, it can feel painfully slow sometimes just waiting for your gun to be able to fire, especially once you get used to using these attachments. And with that, that is of course just my opinion on these grips based on the breakdown that I've done as well as my experiences with them. And this is where I want to hear from you guys in those comments down below. How do you feel about the ergonomic and the CQB grips in Black Ops 6? Do you find that they're absolutely necessary on your class setups? Or maybe not? Do you find maybe they're just overkill or just not very useful for your particular playstyle? Just let me know down below. If you enjoyed the video, a like rating is always appreciated. And don't forget to subscribe for more if you haven't already. I'll talk to you guys next time.